There are many discriminatory factors in Of Mice and Men, but the most prominent of them are sexism, racism, and ableism. Curly's wife is probably the best example of sexism in the book. She's never given an actual name, and she's never really a full fleshed character. The only women in the book that are given names are the owners, and they're only mentioned briefly. During this time, women tended to go into housewife and trophy wife archetypes, um, where they were more homemakers and seen as less valuable because they weren't bringing in money. But in the 1920s, there was a rise in women in the workplace. 50% of unmarried women were working at this time as seamstresses, teachers, and other feminized jobs, which rose their standard in society, but also decreased the value of those jobs because they were seen as less than because women were working them. But 10% of married women started to go into these positions as well. Today, there is still a very prominent age gap. In 2020, a study was done by Pew Research Facility, I believe, that showed women made 84% of what men made in that year. And it would take a woman 42 days to equal out to what her male colleague would have made that year. Another very large portion of the book went to racism. Crooks was the only black character, but you can see very clearly that he wasn't a full flesh character either. He was definitely more developed than Curly's wife, but for the most part, he was either called Stable or Crooks. He wasn't even sleeping in the house with the other men. He tended to sleep in the barn and was actually chased and beaten for fun at one point, and it's looked back fairly fondly. In that time period, we saw a rise in the Ku Klux Klan with the new generation of it coming to fruition, um, that had stronger influence in the government. Black men and women in that time worked on the railroads, truly making changing our country as a whole, um, as well as the Great Migration, which after it started after the Civil War, where freedmen and their families would travel from the South up to the Northeast, typically, and looking for jobs and a less racist society. Even though there was racism all over the country, it tended to be less so up in the North. Um, Today, racism is not necessarily decreased, but it's more subtle. Uh, Over the summers and in 2020, especially, the Black Lives Matter movement came in waves. While the Black Lives Matter movement and many other movements like it, like the NAACP, have been around for years, it came a lot in the news more because of the shooting of George Floyd and the overall, not necessarily rise in police brutality, but more visibility in it. Um, the last point of discrimination would be ableism in this book. Um, Lenny was mentally challenged, and what really showed ableism and a lack of understanding in this time period was how George specifically treated Lenny, since he was always yelling at him and blaming Lenny in particular for his mental disability, even though he couldn't control it. A lot of people also called Lenny crazy, which just showed more a lack of understanding of mental disabilities in this time period. During this era, most people with mental disabilities would be sent to institutions where they would perform electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and in the bottom left corner, you can see an example of a sensory box. The middle is electroshock therapy, and a lobotomy at the time was they would take an ice pick and insert it into the brain and take out a chunk of the brain. Today, it's a little bit more controlled, but they still occur. There are also still mental institutions like this today, but they're significantly more humane than they were in this time period. Today, people still struggle with job availability. A lot of people do not want to hire people with disabilities, mental or physical, And social isolation is also a major problem today. A lot of people, like the person in the bottom left corner, her YouTube channel is called Dissociated. She educates people on dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, in order to normalize people with mental disabilities. Many people fight today still for inclusion, not only like accessible doorways and ramps and things like that, but interpreters for deaf people and more braille for blind people, just trying to bring people with mental and physical disabilities into society. Um, there are many more topics of discrimination in the book, but these are definitely the most prevalent today and in the time period, and that is why the author chose to highlight them the most, and why the book is still prevalent and necessary to read today.